Hello and welcome to State of the Economy. Today we have with us Mr. Gajendra Haldea, advisor in the Planning Commission with a special focus on infrastructure. In fact, Mr. Haldea has done a lot of work on design of public-private partnerships in the infrastructure sector, and a lot of his work has resulted in the PPPs which have emerged in our country over the past 7-8 years. Although a lot of problems are also seen in PPPs, so today we will try to get a comprehensive view of where are the PPPs headed in roads, ports, airports, etc. Welcome to our show, Mr. Gajendra Haldea. So you were primarily responsible in the government to design appropriate model concession agreements which are driving a whole lot of public-private partnership projects in roads, in airports, in the power sector, etc. Tell us, how would you assess the performance of PPPs so far? You've done your best to design as watertight PPPs as possible, but what we are seeing now, for various reasons, a lot of PPPs are coming unstuck, especially in the road sector. In recent weeks, many road companies are moving away from the project, from the commitments, indeed citing various reasons, including lack of environmental clearance, etc. In the airport sector also, well-designed PPPs are running into problems because the operators don't seem to have made some miscalculation on the risk, assessment of risk. I don't know how far they are credible, what they are saying, the companies. So therefore, we want you to just give us an idea of what's going on with PPPs in, say, roads, airports, etc.
Well, thank you. I think PPPs by and large can be regarded as quite successful in India if you look at the macro perspective. We've got a lot of investment. There are some problems, one can't deny that. You know, as a result of the very accelerated inflow of private investment, compared to 5% of GDP in the 11th plan, we have been able to get 7.2% of GDP in the last plan. Okay. So there's a very significant acceleration in investment. So you see better roads, more investment in airports, etc. Sure. That is not to say that we have not come across problems. If you do any work of this nature or this proportion, there are bound to be problems. Yeah. Now, first and foremost about the model concession agreements and the problems that you are mentioning about a couple of the projects. You know, it's a matter of great...
Like the road projects. Yeah. Why are people running away from...
I'll explain. First, about the structure of the concession agreements. Okay. Because in a PPP, the heart of a project is the concession agreement that lays down the terms and conditions of the entire contract and engagement. Sure. The good news is that so far, a few hundred projects have been awarded, have been constructed, large number of them are operating on the basis of model concession agreements issued by the Planning Commission. Yeah. The good news is that none of the provisions of the concession agreement have so far come into any criticism from court, CAG, CBI, CVC, or anybody for that matter. Sure. Okay. You have problems in some other concession agreements, right? But they're not model concession agreements. Now, what is great about model concession agreement? The strength of a model concession agreement is that we follow a very elaborate process of consultation with stakeholders and experts, and we produce many revised versions till we are satisfied that it's a good document which contains a precise statement of public policy, the allocation of risks and rewards, and it's enforceable, etc., etc. It's predictable and so on. So all the requirements of a good framework are built in.
Sure, sure. If anything, you've been accused of being too stringent on those model concession
you know, when you deal with common people, when you deal with public exchequer, when you deal with
you have to be stringent.
You've got to be at least cautious and balanced, right? So you can't take things lightly or in a great hurry, because you are dealing with very large public interest.
Sure.
Having said that, now you're saying there are some problems in the road sector. True, I've also heard about them, read about them and so on. These are specific to projects and investors and have very little to do with the concession agreement or with the framework. Yeah. Now, very broadly speaking, you've heard that some people are wanting to walk out.
Yeah.
This is happening probably because of 2 or 3 reasons. First and foremost, I think many of these concessionaires are overstretched. I think they bid and took projects beyond their capacity in terms of equity and debt.
Yeah. So they over leveraged their balance sheet and they didn't assess the extent of leveraging that they would go
right.
through.
Now, I'm not pointing to one company or one project or the other, but I'm giving you a general
I agree with that's the general trend. That's my assessment.
That's one problem. Second problem is that the banks, in my view, were deficient in the kind of due diligence required for financing PPP projects, and they were lending more money on more easy terms than should normally be expected.
Okay.
That they've got some lessons because of these relaxations. Yeah. So they have become conservative. So suddenly, if you become conservative, then you reduce the supply of debt to these projects. Yeah. So that's also creating a problem. This behavior, errant behavior on the part of many banks is, first you make mistakes, and then in order to correct them, you cause a problem in the sector. Yeah. That's, you can comment on that in favor of or against. But
meanwhile, the decline in the economy has also created a certain...
That is the third problem.
Yeah.
When people bid out projects or, took these projects, the expectations in the economy were more robust than they are today. So there is a there is a problem of expectations, but we should address that a little more carefully. So people bid in a more over exuberance frame of mind.
Sure.
But actually, if you come to think hard, this is not such a great problem, because these are 25, 30, 40-year projects. So if you thought that the average traffic growth will be, let's say, 6% over time, and if you thought that in the first 2 years it will be higher than normal, but it turns out to be lower, well, you can hope that it will catch up.
So you're essentially also saying, Mr. Haldea, that the present economic downturn also seems to be aggravating this problem, but partly in a more long-term average, if you take, some of these projects will come back to to viability.
Right. Infrastructure project or investment in infrastructure project is not like putting money in the stock market, which is volatile and keeps going up and down, depending on the market sentiment, market mood, etc. Infrastructure projects, the investment is scheduled over a period of 25, 30, 40 years. Yeah. So if there is a stress for 6 months, 1 year, really speaking, it should not change the project economics.
Okay, the long-term economics.
Exactly.
So in the sense, you're saying they're long-term viable, and to that extent, even banks need not really worry about big NPAs coming in the infrastructure sector?
Banks have actually overlent in case of individual projects. Okay. The cost assessed for a project through private consultants in many cases was, let's say, 1,000 crores. Banks accepted the cost to be, let's say, 1,500 crores. So if you have lent more, then you've changed the terms of financing. Okay. Now for you to say that the project is not viable, well, the project was scheduled to cost or expected to cost 1,000 crores. Yeah. And that's not a government figure. That is a figure produced by a private consultant, proper consulting firm engaged by, let's say, NHAI. Banks listen to another private consultant and agree to finance 1,500 crores. So that is one practice which has created many aberrations.
Okay. We'll take a small break here, Mr. Haldea. Please don't go away and stay with us. Welcome back to State of the Economy. We are having a conversation with Mr. Gajendra Haldea, advisor in the Planning Commission, looking specifically after the infrastructure projects under the public-private partnership. Mr. Haldea, we were talking about PPPs, which you have designed with so much care, where I say you in the Planning Commission as well. Now, and you also said that the model concession agreements based on which these PPPs work are not necessarily responsible today for some of the big companies abandoning some projects in the road sector, in other sectors too. Probably they are overstretched because of their balance sheet leverage. Now, there were some projects, Mr. Haldea, where you had also raised a timely warning in the sense, I have one example with me in the Delhi-Noida toll bridge project. You had very clearly put on the website of the Planning Commission that the terms are very skewed in favor of the promoter. Similarly, you had also, there's a history of you having given similar warnings, which indeed helped subsequent policy making. I'm not saying that you did the wrong thing. In the case of Enron, for instance, you had warned that time that the terms indeed were very skewed in favor of the multinational company, power company. Now, in policy making, how do you address this? Today, GMR has built an airport in Delhi, and it is now saying that maybe the terms, they deserve better terms than what they got. Now, how do you judge these situations?
You know, if you do adequate due diligence and look at the literature, look at the principles, you shouldn't be making these mistakes. Okay, it's not rocket science. In most cases, say Enron, as you mentioned, or Noida Toll Bridge you mentioned, and a number of other projects, at least in the initial stage of PPPs, were such that the concession agreement or the project agreement was actually drafted or structured by the private entity who was the beneficiary.
Okay.
So you shouldn't be surprised at the outcome. Actually,
so they were very obviously skewed in their favor. That's what you say.
Absolutely. So when we started doing this work a couple of years ago, the first point we made was that these should be prepared by the government. Before you have a concessionaire breathing down your neck. And this should be a common agreement, this should be a model agreement, it should say public policy clearly, it should look at public interest, it should look at user interest, yet enable the concessionaires to make the market based.
So to strike a balance between public interest and private profit.
Exactly, and you have to remember that infrastructure projects are public projects. And we are trying to get private money into public projects. Not the other way.
That's when this model concession agreement was born, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So I have been a practitioner of model concession agreements for over a decade, and I strongly believe that they make a lot of difference. In fact, now a large number of countries, including in the developed world, have begun to recognize the value of our work, and many of them are trying to even follow or replicate it in some way or the other.
Okay.
Now, in the case of airport, the problem has arisen because the structure of the project had what, in my view, was a bit of a flaw. You see, the tariffs of Delhi airport are fixed on a cost plus basis. So there is, in an arrangement like this, there is always an incentive to pad costs or gold plate costs and demand a higher tariff. Okay, I am not commenting on what is happening in the Delhi airport, I am commenting on a general principle. So cost
which is true for the power sector also.
Which is, cost plus is a bad idea. And you should avoid it as much as you can. So if you take all our model concession agreements, they determine the principles of tariff setting right in the beginning. So all regulation is contained in the contract itself, and we call it regulation by contract. So you don't have these disputes. And in the case of airport, when these deals were actually made, if you look at the record, Planning Commission did repeatedly advise that this method of setting tariffs is actually, in our view, inadequate or flawed, I would say. Yet the wisdom at that time which prevailed was that no, we'll set it in the cost plus manner and we'll leave it to the regulator. So what you are seeing is an outcome of that. And this debate about how much should the tariff be will remain year after year, because at all points of time you will expect the operator to demand a higher tariff, the regulator to balance it out, and the user is always complaining that it is on the higher side.
Okay, okay. So can I ask you one thing? In a developing, there's one argument which comes from people who are left of center, politically speaking. They say that in a society like ours, still developing a large swaths of population, very poor, cost plus works if done with the right intention in favor of public interest. For instance, if you take power sector, if you do auctions of coal, which begins with, say, coal-based power, and if everything is market determined, then the consumer will end up paying a much higher tariff. At the same time, if you deliver coal at a certain regulated price and strictly monitor how much the coal is used for generating power and for distribution, the cost of distribution, etc., then there is no, you could actually control, regulate end price of the consumer. How do you respond to that?
You know, coal or fuel constitutes, as we all know, an important element of the power tariff. Now, the price of coal or fuel is actually not in the control of the power producer. If I am a power producer, I have no control on price of fuel, right? You have no control over the price of petrol that you buy every day, right? Same thing. The correct thing, which the power ministry is now, accepted and wants to do, I understand, is that price of fuel should be a pass-through. It should not be a profit center. So if the price of fuel goes up, it should be passed on to the consumer, end consumer of electricity, and if the price goes down, it should be passed on to the consumer. So that's one part. Now, what should the price?
But if you auction coal,
I'm answering that.
Yeah.
So now the question is, at what should be the price of coal?
Exactly.
Now this is a nationalized industry.
Exactly.
And you have a regulated price of coal, and you have e-auction. The basic principle should be that if the producer is getting the benefit of the regulated price, which might be half of the market price, then this must be passed on to the end consumer.
Yeah.
If, on the other hand, he is buying at market rates, then he should be allowed to pass that on. Right? You cannot have a situation where people are asked to buy at the market price, spend a lot of money, and then make losses and supply to consumers at a cheaper rate, or get coal at a very cheap price and then sell electricity at a higher rate. Both are flawed. So you have to very clearly isolate the costs of fuel and make them pass through.
Make them pass through. Okay. So so that's the policy which is now being followed?
That is the thinking which has emerged in the government, and I hope that will be mandated.
Because in some cases we see now that people have got coal blocks at regulated prices, in the sense they are not paying market price for coal, but they are selling power in the merchant segment. So that isn't that flawed?
Yeah, as a consumer, you might feel shortchanged that there is a national resource which has been given to somebody in a negotiated manner, not through an auction. So he's got access to that at a very low price, and now he's using that to sell that electricity or the produce of that fuel to you at 3 times the price.
Yes.
Now,
so much that they are amortizing their fixed cost in 2-3 years time.
Quite right. So this will be,
flawed policy.
Flawed policy, and this will be categorized as windfall gain.
Windfall gain.
Which public policy should not encourage or permit.
Yeah. We'll take a small break here. This is becoming very interesting. Please don't go away and stay with us. Welcome back to State of the Economy. We are having a conversation with Mr. Gajendra Haldea, advisor in the Planning Commission on infrastructure. Mr. Haldea, you were very interestingly you were talking about the perils of cost plus. At the same time, my point was, in a society like ours, in some cases cost plus becomes essential. You can't get away from cost plus, especially when you have to deliver power, electricity, even gas, fuels at reasonably low price to the poor. Now, coming back to PPPs, how do you assess the pricing of services to the end consumer in PPPs? Is there any regulatory mechanism which what is the basis for increasing prices to the end consumer? For instance, the power tariffs are being they get raised from time to time. The consumer sometimes is confused as to what is the basis for the increase in power tariff. Is there enough transparency in this whole process? This is a question that I posed.
No, there isn't enough transparency, that is for sure. Because power tariffs, if you're talking of, have a huge element of politicization in determining the tariffs. I'm not saying that it is unwanted. It might be wanted partly because tariffs have to be at the end of the day affordable. But then public policy should equally address the issue of bringing down these costs. Now, how do you bring down these costs? Well, there is a huge amount of theft and other losses going on in the distribution companies. There is a huge amount of lack of recovery, inefficiencies, high staff costs, high distribution costs. Now, these can't be justified. And since they can't be passed on, the political impulse is to keep tariffs low, which means losses build up. Let's remember there are no free lunches. So if you want to keep tariffs lower than what it costs, then somebody will have to foot the bill. And that bill is going to be ultimately paid by you and me. Either we pay higher user charges or we allow them to build losses and the state government will have to subsidize. So we will pay eventually as taxpayers. So you either pay as a user or you pay as a taxpayer. Ultimately, this is going to be passed on to you. So the important thing is to make these things efficient and transparent. Now,
is there enough political will? Our political economy doesn't seem to resolve. Be ready to resolve some of these issues.
I agree with you, and I would not put the entire responsibility at the doorstep of the political leaders, though of course being leaders they must share bulk of the responsibility. The problem is that in most of the departments or ministries or corporate entities, including distribution companies, the incumbent bureaucracy and technocracy, right from the managing director to the linesman, they are all beneficiaries of these monopoly arrangements. Either through great deal of power over the fiefdom that they enjoy, or through corruption, or through pilferage.
So there is a political economy which
perpetuates
this arrangement.
Exactly. So a huge body of individuals
who are not just politicians.
Not just politicians. They all influence political opinion, and the politicians don't want to annoy them. Politicians often get misled by thinking that, well, these 20,000 employees, I should keep them happy, without actually being very clear that by keeping these 20,000 happy, you are
how much system damage that you are causing.
Right. Take the case of Coal India. You might be keeping happy a couple of lakh, maybe 8-10 lakh union leaders, but look what it has done. There is no coal, so there is no power.
I'm coming to this, Mr. Haldea. Pricing is one thing. At what price are you delivering to the consumer? It's an important issue, whether it's transparent or not. You said it is not transparent, but now I'm coming to a much bigger issue, which is supply. We seem to be having all the wherewithal, the resources to supply, yet because of various reasons, there is a huge supply constraint being created. For instance, 20,000 megawatts of power capacity waiting for fuel linkage. The Environment Ministry not being able to give clearances for either power projects, for coal blocks for power projects, or even for roads which ostensibly go through some forest areas. Now, why are we stuck on this supply issue? Why can't we increase supply?
You see, supply...
When there is such a deficit, why can't we increase supply? Price comes later.
I agree. Supply, one can be one aspect of supply is the production capacity. Another is clearances.
Yeah.
Quite clearly,
We are talking about clearances here.
right. Quite clearly, we have I would say, a mess in terms of getting our clearances. And in response to that, government has set up the Cabinet Committee on Investment. Let's hope that they will untangle some of the problems and allow development to get accelerated. So that's one part, that's clearances. The other part is the industry structure itself. Let's assume that by some magic wand you get all the clearances and you had all the power produced. If you increase power supply by 20%, your distribution companies don't have the money to buy this power.
Sure.
Because every unit they buy, they add to their losses. They're not recovering enough money.
Yeah.
So then all that is getting hidden because we are concentrating only on environment clearance and putting all the blame there. If all this were actually produced, even then you are not ready to deliver, because the electricity sector as a whole continues to be a state-owned monopoly, except for power generation. But power generation can't do much if everybody else, in the distribution segment especially, is all state-controlled and making losses. So there are some basic reforms required in the power sector. Unfortunately, the Electricity Act 2003, 10 years have passed, it remains to be implemented. Competition has not been introduced. What has been happening?
At the last mile, there is no competition.
No. And this happened in the entire developed world more than a decade ago. In the power sector, we are still third world. In telecom, we are first world.
In roads?
Well, in roads, we are trying to catch up. You know, the kind of private...
Yes, second world, I guess.
Yeah, you know, the kind of, the manner in which private investment has come in road during the last 5 years, you won't find that easily in any other country. So there's a lot of cause for satisfaction, but that is not to say that you know, this is sufficient. This is a small part of what we actually need. So we have to do much, much more. But
so we've done much better in roads, but
that's right.
Power, we are clearly in the third world.
I have no doubt about that.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Haldea. It was good talking to you. That's all we have in this edition of State of the Economy. We'll be back with the next edition soon. Thank you.